Her ex-husband mocked her in court, but when she exposed the real reason for the divorce, he froze. The world once seemed perfect for Eleanor. Married for nearly 10 years, she had built a life alongside Vincent, a successful businessman who, to outsiders, appeared to be the ideal husband. He was charming, well-respected, and always had a confident smile that made everyone believe their marriage was one of admiration and stability. Eleanor, on the other hand, had dedicated herself to being a supportive wife. She had sacrificed her own career, dreams, and ambitions to stand by Vincent, ensuring that their home was warm and welcoming, believing she was contributing to a shared future. But beneath the surface, the cracks in their marriage had already begun to form, cracks she was too blinded by loyalty to notice. Vincent's affectionate words had turned into distant murmurs. The man who once made time for intimate dinners now worked late every night without explanation. Their conversations became routine, lacking warmth, reduced to short exchanges about bills or social events. Eleanor tried to reason with herself, convincing herself that perhaps stress from work had caused his change in demeanor. Yet, as time passed, his coldness became deliberate. He no longer looked at her the same way. The love that had once been in his eyes had faded into something unrecognizable, indifference, perhaps even resentment. Then came the dismissiveness. Eleanor's presence became almost invisible to Vincent. He no longer acknowledged her efforts, nor did he express any interest in her life. When she brought up concerns, he brushed them aside, often laughing coldly and saying she was overthinking things. His words stung, each dismissal a small cut to her heart. The man she had once known was vanishing before her eyes, and in his place stood someone who no longer respected or valued her. She wanted to believe that things could return to normal, that this was just a phase. But deep inside, she feared the truth. Vincent had already moved on emotionally. It wasn't until one particular evening, when he returned home in the early hours of the morning smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, that Eleanor knew she had to face reality. She asked him where he had been, her voice trembling, but Vincent only chuckled, shaking his head. "Why do you even care?" he muttered, his eyes void of the love they once held for her. That was the moment she realized she was no longer a part of his world. After that night, Vincent no longer bothered to pretend. His distance turned into open hostility. He came home less frequently, and when he did, he barely acknowledged Eleanor's presence. The warmth that once filled their home had been replaced by an icy silence, thick with unspoken words and resentment. He no longer tried to make excuses for his absences, he simply stopped caring if she knew where he was or who he was with. The message was clear, she no longer mattered to him. The bank statements confirmed her worst fears. Eleanor had never been deeply involved in their finances, trusting Vincent to handle them. But when she noticed unusual withdrawals, large sums disappearing without explanation, she decided to investigate. What she found left her breathless. Vincent had been funneling money into a separate account, and an unfamiliar woman's name appeared on several transactions. Lavish dinners, expensive jewelry, hotel stays, there was no denying the truth. He had been spending their shared money on someone else. When she confronted him, expecting guilt or at least some attempt at an excuse, he merely laughed. "What did you expect, Eleanor? You've been nothing but a shadow in this house for years. I need excitement, and you're just boring." The cruelty in his voice was worse than the betrayal itself. She had sacrificed so much for him, given up her own dreams to support his, and in return, he discarded her as if she were nothing more than an old, forgotten possession. Eleanor wanted to believe that there was still something to salvage, but Vincent had already made his choice. His actions became bolder, as if he no longer cared whether she knew about his infidelity. He answered phone calls right in front of her, speaking in hushed tones, smirking as he walked away. He spent nights away from home without explanation, and when she questioned him, he dismissed her like an inconvenience. Then came the ultimate betrayal. She overheard him on the phone one evening, standing just outside their bedroom. His voice was filled with amusement. "She's clueless. Honestly, I don't even know why she's still here. She has nothing. If she left, she wouldn't survive a day on her own." The words struck like a dagger. He didn't just cheat on her, he had stripped her of her dignity, reduced her to nothing in his mind. Tears burned in Eleanor's eyes, but amidst the heartbreak, something inside her hardened. She had spent years being the devoted wife, believing that love meant sacrifice. But love was not supposed to be cruel. It was not supposed to humiliate. And at that moment, she made a silent vow Vincent would not break her. He had underestimated her strength, and soon, he would regret it. Eleanor had always believed that trust was the foundation of any marriage. But as she stood in their bedroom, staring at the evidence before her, she realized how blind she had been. A hotel receipt lay on Vincent's nightstand, carelessly discarded, with a woman's name listed under additional guest. The date confirmed what she had feared: this affair had been going on for months. Her hands trembled as she picked up the receipt, her mind racing. Had all those nights he claimed to be working late been lies? Had their entire marriage been nothing but a carefully crafted illusion? The weight of his betrayal settled heavily on her chest, suffocating her. She confronted him that evening, holding the receipt between her fingers like a weapon. Vincent, seated comfortably on the couch, merely glanced at it and smirked. "And," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "what do you think you're going to do about it?" His words struck a nerve, igniting a fire within her that she hadn't felt in years. He didn't even have the decency to deny it. To him, she wasn't even worth the effort of an excuse. The humiliation burned deep, but beneath it, anger simmered. For years, she had been the devoted wife, supporting his ambitions, sacrificing her own dreams. And this was how he repaid her? She clenched her fists, vowing that she would not let him reduce her to nothing. Vincent's arrogance knew no bounds. Instead of showing remorse, he leaned back, completely unfazed by her pain. "You should be grateful," he sneered, swirling the drink in his hand. "You've lived a comfortable life because of me. If you think you can walk away and take anything with you, think again." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just about an affair, Vincent had been planning this for a long time. He was making sure that when he discarded her, she would have nothing left. She could see it in his eyes, the way he spoke with such confidence. He truly believed she was powerless. But he had underestimated her. If he thought she would go quietly, he was wrong. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her mind already working on her next move. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to plead. She would let him believe he had won, until it was too late for him to stop what was coming. That night, she locked herself in the guest room and began gathering every document she could find. Bank statements, business contracts, property deeds. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something told her Vincent had more secrets buried beneath the surface. And when she found them, she would make sure he regretted ever underestimating her. The following morning, Vincent didn't even bother to acknowledge her as he prepared to leave. He adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, a smirk playing on his lips. "I think it's time we end this, Eleanor," he said, his voice casual, as if discussing an insignificant business deal. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready soon. I'll make sure you get a small settlement, just enough to keep you from starving." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. He wasn't just leaving her, he was making sure she had nothing to her name. Every shared asset had somehow been transferred to his name without her knowledge. He had orchestrated this perfectly, stripping her of any legal claim before even filing for divorce. But he wasn't done. "You don't need to drag this out," he continued, buttoning his cufflinks. "Sign the papers, walk away quietly, and maybe I'll be generous. Fight me, and I'll make sure you regret it." His arrogance was infuriating. He truly believed she would crumble, that she would accept whatever scraps he decided to throw her way. But Eleanor refused to be his victim. If Vincent thought he could humiliate her, destroy her dignity, and cast her aside, he was about to learn a painful lesson. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't quite feel yet. "Do whatever you think is best," she said evenly. "But don't expect me to make this easy for you." Vincent wasted no time. Within days, Eleanor received the divorce papers, delivered coldly by a courier as if they were just another business contract. The documents were as cruel as expected. He had claimed complete ownership of everything, from their marital home to their shared accounts. There was nothing left for her. He had even gone as far as listing her as financially dependent, implying she had no right to alimony. Reading through the papers, Eleanor felt the weight of his betrayal sink deeper. This wasn't just about ending their marriage. Vincent wanted to erase her completely, leaving her with no resources, no dignity, no future. But what he hadn't accounted for was her resilience. Instead of signing, Eleanor sought legal counsel. She wasn't going to let him take everything without a fight. Her lawyer, a sharp and experienced woman named Margaret, listened carefully as Eleanor detailed everything: his infidelity, the financial manipulation, the way he had systematically stripped her of her rights. Margaret's expression hardened. "He thinks he's invincible," she said, flipping through the documents. "But he made one mistake. He underestimated you. We're going to fight this, and we're going to make sure he regrets every single move he's made." Eleanor nodded, determination settling into her bones. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. This was about reclaiming herself. The day of the first hearing arrived, and Vincent walked into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He wore an expensive suit, his hair neatly styled, and a smirk that made Eleanor's blood boil. He barely glanced at her, as if she was nothing more than an inconvenience he had to deal with before moving on with his life. He had an air of certainty, the assurance of a man who had played his cards well. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as people observed him, many whispering about his reputation as a successful businessman. He had even managed to charm the judge before the session had begun, offering polite smiles and firm handshakes. Eleanor, on the other hand, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't need to match his theatrics. She had something far more powerful: patience. As the hearing began, Vincent wasted no time painting himself as the victim. He spoke with feigned sadness, claiming that he had supported Eleanor financially for years, only for her to become resentful and irrational. He made it sound as if she had no contribution to their marriage, as if she had done nothing but drain him emotionally and financially. He spun his story well, his words laced with just enough truth to be convincing. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding, seemingly buying into his narrative. Eleanor remained silent, letting him dig his own grave. She knew what was coming. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, going through every financial record, every transaction, and every hidden asset Vincent had tried to conceal. And when it was finally her turn to speak, she would reveal something that would make his smirk disappear for good. Vincent had spent years controlling every aspect of their lives, but he was about to learn the hard way. He wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Vincent's performance was flawless. He spoke with the polished ease of a man who had rehearsed his lies 100 times. His voice dripped with feigned disappointment as he detailed how Eleanor had been an ungrateful, dependent wife who had no real contributions to their marriage. He painted himself as a generous provider, a man who had done everything for a woman who had failed to appreciate his sacrifices. The courtroom listened, some nodding sympathetically, while Eleanor sat quietly, allowing him to dig deeper into his own deception. As he spoke, Vincent glanced in her direction, his smirk barely concealed. "She lived off my success for years," he said, shaking his head dramatically. "I gave her everything, but she never once lifted a finger to support me. And now, she wants to take what isn't hers." His attorney added to the humiliation, emphasizing that Eleanor had no source of income, no career history, and no financial independence. The underlying message was clear: she was nothing without him. The words stung, but Eleanor refused to react. Let him think she was weak. Let him believe she was defeated. The moment she spoke, the entire courtroom would see the truth he had desperately tried to hide. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, seemed to consider Vincent's words carefully. His expression was neutral, but Eleanor noticed the subtle nods he gave in response to Vincent's arguments. It was clear that her ex-husband had successfully shaped the narrative, casting himself as the responsible, hardworking man burdened by an undeserving wife. Eleanor's lawyer, Margaret, watched silently, her fingers tapping against the table, waiting for the right moment to strike. The game was far from over. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, the judge turned to her with an almost expectant look. Perhaps he was waiting for her to crumble under pressure, to confirm Vincent's claims that she was weak and incapable. But Eleanor sat up straighter, her voice calm and measured. "Your Honor," she said, her tone unwavering, "before I respond to these accusations, I'd like to submit some documents for the court's review." Vincent's smirk faltered just slightly as she handed the papers to Margaret, who then passed them to the judge. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, his expression shifted. The courtroom was silent as the judge flipped through the documents. His initial neutral demeanor hardened into something unreadable, his lips pressing into a thin line. Vincent, still confident, crossed his arms and let out a small chuckle. "More nonsense, I'm sure," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. But Eleanor ignored him, her focus solely on the judge's reaction. Finally, the judge looked up, fixing Vincent with an unreadable stare. "Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "are you aware that your wife was listed as a co-owner of multiple business ventures under your name?" Vincent's face twitched slightly, but he quickly masked it with feigned confusion. "That can't be right," he scoffed. "She never had anything to do with my businesses." The judge turned another page. "Then perhaps you can explain why we have signed documents, bearing your signature, confirming that your wife was an equal partner in your real estate investments?" The color drained from Vincent's face. Murmurs erupted in the courtroom as journalists scribbled notes and spectators leaned in, eager to catch every detail. Vincent's lawyer shuffled through his own copies of the documents, his eyes narrowing as he whispered something urgently to his client. Eleanor remained composed, though her heart pounded in her chest. This was only the beginning. She had spent weeks digging through financial records, uncovering proof that Vincent had secretly funneled profits into hidden accounts while ensuring her name was erased from the paper trail. But he had made mistakes she now held in her hands. I believe these documents prove that I was not a financial burden, as my ex-husband so passionately claimed, Eleanor continued, her voice steady. In fact, they show that I was an active contributor to our assets, and yet, I was intentionally removed from all records shortly before he filed for divorce. I ask the court to consider whether this was an attempt to manipulate the division of assets. The judge's expression darkened, and for the first time, Vincent looked genuinely unsettled. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The courtroom now saw him for what he was, a liar caught in his own web of deceit. A stunned silence filled the courtroom as the weight of Eleanor's revelation sank in. People exchanged wide-eyed glances, some whispering amongst themselves. Even Vincent's lawyer seemed momentarily at a loss for words, flipping frantically through the pages as if hoping to find some loophole to dismiss them. But the evidence was undeniable. Vincent had spent years ensuring Eleanor had no financial independence, all while secretly using her name to benefit his business deals. He had stripped her of everything while making sure he walked away with it all. Vincent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk long gone. "This is absurd," he finally spat, his voice tight with anger. "She has no idea what she's talking about." But the judge wasn't convinced. "Then perhaps you can explain these transactions, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked, tapping a specific page with his pen. "Why did your wife's name appear on asset ownership documents only to be removed weeks before you filed for divorce?" Vincent's jaw clenched, his carefully crafted persona unraveling before everyone's eyes. Eleanor watched as Vincent struggled to maintain his composure. The confidence that had carried him through the trial so far was crumbling under the weight of undeniable facts. His hands, once relaxed on the table, were now clenched into fists. His once arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced with an expression Eleanor had never seen before, genuine fear. For the first time in their marriage, he wasn't the one in control. He was cornered, with no easy way out. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "Mr. Caldwell, these documents suggest deliberate financial manipulation and potential fraud. I am granting Mrs. Caldwell's legal team additional time to investigate these claims further before issuing a final ruling." Vincent shot up from his seat. "You can't be serious," he exclaimed, his voice shaking. "She's just trying to ruin me." The judge's gaze remained firm. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." The command was calm but absolute. For the first time, Vincent obeyed without argument. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Vincent's lawyer desperately attempted to salvage the case, flipping through his notes while whispering furiously to his client. But there was no escaping the truth. Eleanor had spent years being dismissed, belittled, and cast aside, but now, with the weight of undeniable evidence on her side, she was the one who held the power. The tables had turned, and Vincent knew it. Eleanor turned to the judge, her voice unwavering. "I trusted my husband," she said. "I supported him, believing we were building a life together. But the reality was that he had been planning my downfall long before this divorce. I ask this court to consider, if I was as worthless as he claimed, why did he use my name to secure his wealth? Why did he erase my name when he no longer needed me?" The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply studied Vincent, who sat motionless, knowing there was no good answer to that question. For the first time, the outcome of this trial was no longer in his hands. Vincent sat frozen, his mind racing to find an escape, but there was none. The judge continued flipping through the documents, his expression darkening with each page. Eleanor had come prepared. Every detail of Vincent's deception had been laid bare: hidden bank accounts, property transfers, and fraudulent business dealings conducted under her name. He had orchestrated everything to ensure she would be left with nothing, but now, his own schemes were working against him. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the once respected businessman now nothing more than a man caught in his own lies. Eleanor didn't look at Vincent. She kept her focus on the judge, her hands resting steadily on the table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "these documents show a pattern of financial misconduct, manipulation, and an intentional effort to deprive me of my rightful share. If my ex-husband was willing to go this far to erase my existence from our assets, I ask the court to consider, what else is he hiding?" The judge's eyes flicked to Vincent, who had gone deathly pale. He opened his mouth, perhaps to object, but no words came out. Vincent's lawyer was frantically whispering to him, urging him to regain control, but he was crumbling under the weight of the revelations. The evidence Eleanor presented was damning enough, but there was more, much more. Margaret, her lawyer, stood confidently and handed another set of documents to the judge. These transactions show that Mr. Caldwell moved substantial funds offshore under a corporation that, according to these records, doesn't exist in any legitimate capacity. "Your Honor, we are no longer discussing a simple divorce dispute. This could constitute financial fraud." The courtroom gasped as the words sank in. Vincent's composure shattered. He slammed his hands against the table. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice rising in desperation. "She's making this up." But his outburst only worked against him. The judge's eyes narrowed, clearly unimpressed. "Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you control yourself," he warned. "The evidence speaks for itself." Vincent's breathing was heavy, his once unshakable confidence now replaced by visible panic. The judge turned back to Eleanor. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you requesting that we delay the ruling to allow further investigation into these claims?" Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there is more to uncover." The judge sighed heavily, setting the documents aside. "Given the serious nature of these allegations, I have no choice but to extend this case for further review," he declared. Vincent's lawyer attempted to intervene, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "And until we can determine the full extent of these financial irregularities, I am placing a hold on all contested assets, including any accounts or properties under Mr. Caldwell's name." Vincent visibly flinched at the words. This was the worst possible outcome for him. His wealth, his status, everything he had fought to keep from Eleanor, was now frozen. For the first time since the proceedings began, Eleanor allowed herself a small breath of relief. She wasn't victorious yet, but Vincent was no longer in control. He had thought this trial would be his moment of triumph, a final humiliation to strip her of everything. Instead, he was now the one being scrutinized, his lies unraveling in front of the very people he had sought to impress. Vincent leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had underestimated Eleanor. He had thought she was weak. But now, he was the one who had everything to lose. Vincent leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, his face flushed with anger. The polished businessman who had walked into the courtroom with confidence was now barely holding himself together. "We need to shut this down," he hissed. His lawyer nodded quickly, standing up to object. "Your Honor, this is a divorce case, not a financial fraud investigation." The allegations being made against my client are irrelevant to the division of assets. The judge raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Mr. Caldwell's financial dealings are entirely relevant, he countered. Especially if he deliberately attempted to deprive his spouse of her rightful share. Vincent's breathing was uneven. He had spent years ensuring that Eleanor had no access to their finances, no power of her own. He had assumed she would be too naive, too weak to fight back. But here she was, standing before him, methodically dismantling everything he had built. His gaze flicked to her, but Eleanor didn't look at him. She remained poised, unmoved by his spiraling panic. He had always controlled her world, dictated the terms of their life. But he couldn't control this. And for the first time, Vincent Caldwell understood what it felt like to be powerless. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the growing murmurs in the courtroom. Given the evidence presented, this court will conduct a full review of Mr. Caldwell's financial records, he announced. Furthermore, until a ruling is reached, Mrs. Caldwell is granted immediate financial protection, including access to joint assets that were previously withheld. Eleanor felt her breath hitch. This was more than she had hoped for. Not only was Vincent being forced to hand over financial documents, but she was finally gaining access to what had been rightfully hers all along. Vincent shot up from his chair. "You can't do that," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. The judge's glare was sharp. "Mr. Caldwell, sit down," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your actions in this case have raised serious concerns. If you continue this behavior, I will not hesitate to hold you in contempt." Vincent clenched his jaw, but he had no choice. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair, his body radiating tension. He had lost control. And everyone in the room knew it. Eleanor inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had endured years of being dismissed, ignored, and belittled. But now, the truth was out, and Vincent's carefully crafted world was crumbling around him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the power was shifting. And this time, it was in her favor. Vincent sat motionless, his fingers gripping the edges of the table as the judge's ruling echoed through the courtroom. The man who had once strutted in with the confidence of someone untouchable now looked like a cornered animal. His perfectly composed facade had shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. His lawyer was still murmuring hurried instructions in his ear, but Vincent wasn't listening. He was too busy replaying the moment he lost control, the moment Eleanor had exposed the web of lies he had spent years weaving. He had underestimated her, and now, the consequences were crashing down around him. Eleanor, on the other hand, remained composed. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to throw triumphant glances in Vincent's direction. Her victory was evident in his silence, in the way his once smug expression had turned hollow. For years, she had been the one feeling powerless, trapped under his manipulations. But now, Vincent was the one struggling to breathe under the weight of his own deception. The courtroom murmured with hushed excitement, whispers of his downfall spreading among the spectators. His reputation, the carefully curated image he had spent years building, was beginning to crumble. As the judge continued outlining the next steps, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of justice settling over her. The ruling ensured that Vincent's assets would remain frozen until a full investigation could be completed, and in the meantime, she was granted immediate financial support from the very accounts he had tried to withhold from her. It wasn't just about the money, it was about proving that she had never been the helpless, useless woman Vincent had painted her as. She had contributed to their life, and she would no longer allow him to erase her role in their shared success. Margaret, Her lawyer leaned toward her and whispered, "This is better than we could have hoped for. He's losing his grip, and soon, he'll lose everything." Eleanor gave a small nod, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent too long believing she was trapped, too long letting Vincent dictate her worth. But now, the scales had shifted. The judge's words confirmed what she had already begun to realize: she had never needed Vincent. It had always been the other way around. And now, without his wealth and power to shield him, Vincent Caldwell was just another man drowning in his own mistakes. As the courtroom began to clear, Vincent turned toward Eleanor for the first time since the ruling. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with something almost pathetic: desperation. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight, as if forcing himself to be civil. "We don't have to keep dragging this out. If you just sign the papers, I can make things easier for you." The irony was laughable. After everything, he was still trying to control the situation, still clinging to the illusion that he could negotiate his way out of this. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. "You don't get to decide what's easy for me anymore, Vincent," she said simply. There was no anger in her voice, no malice, just a quiet certainty that sent a flicker of something close to fear across his face. She had nothing left to say to him. His words, his tactics, his presence, they no longer held power over her. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, Vincent Caldwell understood what it felt like to be truly powerless. The aftermath of the trial spread quickly. News outlets caught wind of the courtroom drama, and soon, articles detailing Vincent's financial misdeeds and attempted manipulation flooded social media. Former colleagues distanced themselves, clients pulled out of business deals, and even his closest allies hesitated to be associated with him. The man who once thrived on reputation and status was now a cautionary tale, a name whispered with disdain. His downfall wasn't just legal, it was social. The people he had once impressed no longer wanted anything to do with him. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself receiving an unexpected wave of support. Friends she had lost touch with reached out, former acquaintances expressed their admiration, and even strangers sent messages of encouragement. She had spent years feeling invisible, but now, her story resonated with those who had faced similar betrayals. But the greatest victory wasn't the validation from others, it was the realization that she no longer needed anyone else's approval. She had found her strength on her own terms, and nothing Vincent did could take that away from her. On the final day of the trial, Eleanor walked out of the courtroom with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The fight had been long, exhausting, but it was over. She had faced the man who had tried to destroy her and had come out stronger. Vincent, on the other hand, remained seated, staring blankly at the table in front of him. The judge's decision had sealed his fate. His assets were now under review, his businesses under investigation, and his reputation in shambles. Everything he had built on deception was now crumbling, piece by piece. As she stepped outside, the cool air filled her lungs, a reminder that she was free. Free from the weight of Vincent's control, free from the years of humiliation and self-doubt. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," she said with a smile. Eleanor nodded, a quiet smile of her own forming. She wasn't just walking away from a courtroom, she was walking toward the life she had always deserved. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt like a beginning. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor embraced her newfound independence. She no longer woke up with a sense of dread, no longer walked on eggshells around a man who belittled her existence. She moved into a small but comfortable apartment, a space that was entirely her own. Every decision, from the furniture she chose to the color of the walls, was hers to make. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she had missed, control over her own life. She rediscovered passions she had long buried, picking up hobbies she had once loved but abandoned to fit into Vincent's world. She started working again, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to. The freedom to make her own choices, to build a life without fear, was more valuable than any financial settlement. She had once feared losing everything, but in reality, she had gained more than she ever thought possible. Vincent, however, was facing a very different reality. The fallout from the trial was worse than he could have imagined. The businesses he had prided himself on were under scrutiny, his accounts under investigation. His so-called friends had all but vanished, distancing themselves from the scandal he had created. His name, once associated with success, was now synonymous with deception. And worst of all, he knew there was no one to blame but himself. He reached out to old contacts, desperate to salvage what remained of his career, but doors that had once been wide open were now firmly shut. People who had once admired him now spoke of him in hushed tones, shaking their heads at how far he had fallen. The humiliation he had planned for Eleanor had become his own. The woman he had dismissed as weak had walked away stronger than ever, while he was left to pick up the shattered pieces of the empire he had built on lies. One evening, Eleanor received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was from a company she had applied to months ago, before the trial had consumed her life. They had seen her name in the news, read about how she had fought back against Vincent's manipulation. "We admire your resilience," the recruiter said. "We believe someone with your strength and determination would be a valuable asset to our team." Eleanor listened, a slow smile forming. The opportunities she had once thought impossible were now appearing before her. She accepted the job, not because she needed to prove anything to anyone, but because she wanted to. This wasn't about revenge or proving Vincent wrong. This was about reclaiming the life she had always deserved. And this time, she would build it on her own terms. As Eleanor settled into her new life, she often reflected on the journey that had led her here. She had spent years believing that sacrifice and devotion would be enough to hold a marriage together, only to learn that love, true love, was built on mutual respect, not submission. She had given everything to Vincent, but in the end, it was losing him that gave her the freedom to rediscover herself. She no longer carried the weight of his words, no longer replayed the moments of humiliation he had forced upon her. She had survived the storm, and in doing so, she had found her strength. There were days when memories of the past resurfaced, moments when the scars of Vincent's betrayal still stung. But she no longer saw herself as a victim. She had fought for justice, not out of revenge, but because she refused to let someone erase her existence. The trial had proven that she was more than just a woman discarded by a powerful man. She was resilient. She was capable. And most importantly, she was free. With each passing day, she embraced the life she had once feared she would never have, one built not on someone else's expectations, but on her own dreams. Months after the trial, Eleanor received an envelope in the mail. It bore the seal of the courthouse, and for a brief moment, she felt a familiar pang of anxiety. Opening it slowly, she scanned the contents, her eyes widening. It was an official notice informing her that Vincent, now drowning in legal battles over his fraudulent financial dealings, had filed for bankruptcy. His assets were being seized, his accounts frozen indefinitely. The man who had once laughed in her face, who had called her nothing, was now left with nothing himself. The irony wasn't lost on her. Vincent had built his world on power and control, believing he could manipulate his way out of any consequence. But in the end, the very deception he had used to strip her of everything had been his own undoing. Eleanor exhaled, folding the letter and setting it aside. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet, resolute understanding that justice had run its course. As she looked out her window, the city lights shining against the night sky, she smiled. The past no longer had power over her. The future was hers to claim, and this time, she would live it on her own terms.